Hopefully. All right. So today, again, the main focus that I'm going to do is kind of kick things off by talking about some of the general things that we've seen in the Discovery Farms data as far as some of these trade-offs that we've seen on the phosphorus side. And then we're really going to hear about some additional research in other states, as well as some of the things that farmers and agronomists are doing to try to figure out how do we better keep phosphorus on the landscape. But one of the things, since it has been a couple years since we've been able to meet face to face, just wanted to give you a really quick update on some of the projects that Discovery Farms has been working on. So in the past 2 years, we've really sunsetted two pretty big projects that we've done. The first finished in the fall of 2020, which was a 3-year tile monitoring project where we had 24 sites in Northeast Wisconsin. We had a couple of different levels of monitoring where we had some sites with continuous flow, continuous sampling, other sites that had continuous flow monitoring with biweekly sampling. And then we had some final sites which were biweekly sample as well as biweekly flow measurements. And what we did is some modeling to see if we do some of the more intensive monitoring that Discovery Farms typically does, if we can get a bigger bang for our buck with some of these lower cost methods, and are some of these lower cost methods viable for looking at soil phosphorus and nitrogen coming through our tile systems. We did put together in March of this year, we put together a educational series. You can find that video on our Discovery Farms website if you want some more specific information on that tile project. And we are still in the process of developing some additional educational materials based off of that study. The other big project that we've had is down in Rock County, where we've had a core farm cluster. And this project is really the last of Discovery Farm projects that we've kind of traditionally done, where it's been either Discovery Farms or USGS staff collecting the samples down for this project area. So this project has really been kind of the end of an era for the way that Discovery Farms has done most of its monitoring in the past. So down in Rock County, we did monitoring on 2 different farms. One farm, we did a controlled treatment cover crop study where we went through a crop rotation, 2 years of strip-till corn, 1 year of no-till soybeans. We went through 1 full crop rotation and then planting cover crops in one basin, didn't plant cover crops in the other. And we've got some data that we're working up right now for that, and we'll be presenting that at other events here in this winter. The other site really had kind of more diverse crop rotation with some vegetable crops as well as mint. And again, we use that farm as a comparison contrast, where they also had some beef grazing on that site and some manure applications over those wintertime periods. So again, we have just gotten the data back for that and are working up the data from both of those farms, and we'll have that coming out on our website, as well as some educational events here probably early this spring. So now some of the ongoing things that we've got going. So I talked about kind of historically how it's been Discovery Farm staff or USGS that's been doing the sample collection. Well, Minnesota Discovery Farms really led the way by figuring out that if you use some local partners, you can really get a bigger bang for your buck for trying to do these projects. Any of you that have seen where Discovery Farms has done monitoring in the past has been this horseshoe that went from Green Bay, up where I live, down to Madison where we had staff, and then up to Pigeon Falls where our main office was, because windshield time was really a driver on where we could access in the state. So now that we're using partners, not only can we access the entire state, but we get a much better tie-in with the local partners, and these research and outreach efforts are far more collaborative. So, the 3 projects that we installed the fall of 2018, which are still ongoing, is the Antigo Flats in Langley County, where we're actually on 3 different farms there. One of them we just added last fall. And one of the main focuses that we're looking in that region is potato production on these very acidic, high soil test phosphorus soils. And we're finding some very interesting data, more to come, but very surprised at this pH and what effect that might have with binding the phosphorus that is in that soil. And really, we aren't seeing as much as we would expect to see with some of the soil test values that we're seeing in that region. So some really neat preliminary data with that. More to come as we learn more and get this year's data back. In Kewaunee County, where we're doing some monitoring in collaboration with the NRCS demonstration farms, where we're really trying to evaluate 2 different no-till systems. And in the summer of 2020, both grass waterways were established to the NRCS technical specifications. So we had basically 2 years of monitoring pre, and now we've got our first year of monitoring back post, where we're looking at the effectiveness of renovating one waterway and actually establishing another waterway from scratch. So again, data coming in, and we'll be providing more of that as we get into springtime. And then finally, Lake Redstone, which is right on the border of Sauk and Juneau counties. We have 2 sites actually on one farm where we're looking at some ideas of community sharing of manure. For any of you know that basin, the topography is really a challenging factor. Even though a field might be a mile from your farm, it's probably going to take you 3 miles of roads to get there because of the topography and the winding roads. So there's some ideas, very innovative ideas of sharing this, sharing fields that are closer, and also looking at potentially opening up some fallow land for summertime manure applications. So those are some things that we're looking at with that project. And finally, we've had an extremely busy fall, not only removing some of the equipment down in Rock County, but we then transferred that up to 2 new sites that we added in Marathon County, as well as a project over in Pepin. So in Marathon County, again, we're really trying to target sites that are going to be innovative and add to our Discovery Farms database of things that we have not monitored previously. So the one farm that we're on, we're really looking at the cover crops. They've got a very diverse and well-established cover crop program. We want to see how that affects soil and nutrient loss on some pretty tight soils that are on that farm. And then we're also looking at some grazing data from a grazing farm, where we're looking at when those cows access in early spring and late fall, when we typically have wet soils and we're typically open up to some hoof compaction issues and soil disturbance. How does that translate to some of the nutrient loss values on that farm? So we're really excited to add those 2 very progressive farmers to the study design, and are really looking forward to our data collection on both of those farms. And then finally, in Pepin County, Ryan is going to be talking a little bit more about this this afternoon, but we installed on one farm, we've got 2 different sites, each have 4 of these equilibrium tension lysimeters installed. So that's 8 total. And these are really placed below that crop rooting zone in the subsurface, where we can look at nitrate leaching down past that crop root zone. So with these pan lysimeters, we can look at both the concentration as well as that water flux, or amount of water that's flowing through. So we're very excited to kind of add that to our research our repertoire. But the other thing is that this is a site where we're going to be doing a cover crop assessment. And interestingly, this farmer is very active in the cover crop program that they already have. So our treatment is actually going to be to take away the cover crop from that area, which the farmer was somewhat resistant to, but it's for evaluation. So very excited to see data that's coming out of those studies. So that's really kind of a really brief synopsis of some of the things we've been up to over the last time we've been able to meet. But now we're going to be moving into this balancing of phosphorus trade-offs. And one of the ideas or concepts that I try to do is really, with phosphorus, it's much easier with respect to some of the ways that we can lose phosphorus from different agricultural landscapes, because it really is only in 2 forms. We've got the dissolved fraction, and we've got the particulate fraction, which we commonly relate to soil loss. And when we think about a lot of the things that drive the total loss of phosphorus, which is one of these 2 methodologies, we have things that are pretty well established through research and just general knowledge, that when you use tillage versus no till, you're going to have more particulate loss on the tillage side, you're going to have more dissolved loss on the no-till side. Same with the incorporation of manure and fertilizer. More particulate loss because of that soil disturbance on the particulate side, and then if you're surface applying, we see more dissolved losses. Bare soil versus cover crop or surface residue, again, we can see the shifting of our total phosphorus if it's more dissolved or more particulate based on our management system and a lot of these other factors. But we've got this nice kind of point in the middle where it seems like things shift, but Mother Nature likes to throw these curveballs at us. So instead of having this nice point which are kind of teeter-tottering, it makes it far more complex because it's like having a ball underneath that, where the weather can really shift things back and forth with the balance of phosphorus or a particulate and dissolved fractions of that phosphorus. So really, you'll see this in the data, the particulate fraction is really driven really when those soils are not frozen. When we typically see a lot of that soil moving around, we see that particulate fraction really being dominant. When those soils are frozen and that soil matrix is frozen, most of our phosphorus is being lost in the dissolved form. So that's in general. Now we get some of these things in here that can, again, kind of shift these dynamics based on the weather conditions. Winter applications, especially later in the year, can really drive some of the dissolved phosphorus losses. When those soils aren't frozen and we get these runoff events that have close proximity to a manure or fertilizer application, we see a much higher potential for loss. Again, a weather-driven factor. And then finally, one of the things that we've seen in certain years is winter kill of alfalfa and sometimes cover crops can result in some pretty significant total phosphorus loss, often in the dissolved form. And then finally, some things that we can do to control some of these particular dissolved fractions is really on the particulate side. We've got a number of different soil conservation practices which directly target that particulate phosphorus pathway, whereas on the dissolved side, really controlling the soil test phosphorus levels, especially in that upper inch, really can make some significant differences on the dissolved fractions that we see coming off of these landscapes. So now getting into some of the Discovery Farms data. I know a lot of you have seen this before and it is probably a review, but want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So if we know when runoff happens, we can then start targeting practices to really try to mitigate times when we see a lot of water moving. And if you look at that graph, January on the far left-hand side and December on the right, we can see that March is really the month. And on almost all Discovery Farms and every year we've monitored, we've almost always had runoff at every site in March. And that continues to be true. So that is when most of the water is coming off the land when we have snow melt and subsequent rain on those high moisture content soils. And if we look at this on an annual basis, we are pretty evenly split. If we look at all the different farms that we monitored throughout Wisconsin, pretty evenly split. Half of the water comes off when the soils are frozen, half comes off when it's not. Make sense? All right. So now looking at phosphorus, remember I talked about March is the month. Same graph, looking at now total phosphorus loss throughout the year. All of our farms, all of the systems combined. We still see that March peak mirrored in our phosphorus loss. But we also see this secondary peak in May and June. And one of the things that you'll see in here is that the way that we address these are very different. Your farming system and the management practices that you implement on your farm will likely have a higher potential for loss of one of these two times. If we combine all of our data together, this is what we see, but we can definitely see that different farming systems have benefits in the wintertime. Other farming systems have more benefits in that spring planting time when those soils can often be bare and void of actively growing crop. Much like runoff, we've got a pretty even split if we look across all the data about the dissolved and particulate fractions, where we're right down the middle. But when we look seasonally on how these fractions change, it's pretty amazing, actually. If we look at this, the January, February, and March time period when those soils are frozen, we can see that that accounts for almost 40% of the total losses for the year, and almost 70% of the losses during that time period are in the dissolved phosphorus form. Okay, now look at those numbers as they're about to flip from the May through July time period, where we see again about 40% of the annual losses happening in those 3 months, but now 70% of the total phosphorus that's being lost is in the particulate form. So wintertime dissolved, springtime particulate. And again, when those soils are frozen, we don't see a lot of soil loss, but we do see a lot of water interacting with that upper surface of the soil, and our phosphorus loss is in the dissolved form. Whereas when we typically see more soil moving in the springtime of the year, our losses are in the particulate form. Make sense? Good. All right, and to further validate that, when we look at the soil numbers, again, we saw those secondary peaks. That first peak was really driven by that snowmelt runoff. But now that second peak that we're seeing in phosphorus is really driven by soil loss, which we compare the soil loss values in May and June here, where they really stand out. Again, that's where we're getting that secondary period of particulate phosphorus loss that's occurring. So for that time period, soil protection becomes paramount in trying to decrease the amount of soil and resulting particulate phosphorus loss that we're losing during that time period. So things like residue management, cover crops, especially taking those cover crops the additional step, so they aren't winter killing and they're greening back up, and you're planting green, perennial crops, and also reduced or no-till systems really can showcase some of the benefits with reducing the soil loss and resulting particulate phosphorus loss. So now, how do all of these things stack up? And again, to kind of hammer home this idea of trade-offs, where, you know, wintertime, high potential for dissolved phosphorus loss, springtime, high potential of particulate phosphorus loss with the soil that we're losing. So if we look at a tillage system versus a no-till system, and again, this is a culmination of all the data that we've had in both Wisconsin and Minnesota, where we're looking at the total annual soil loss. You can see the variability there on the tillage side, whereas we have much lower variability with phosphorus loss, and we in general see much lower soil loss on the no-till side as compared to the tillage. In fact, we're about almost exactly 4 times the median value for in tillage systems with soil loss as compared to no-till sites. So definitely no-till has the advantage when it comes to soil loss. Things even out a little bit more when we look at total phosphorus loss, again on these same sites. We see much more comparable to diversity with some of these really high loss years in both till as well as no-till sites. We actually see our medians are slightly higher for total phosphorus in our tillage sites versus our no-till sites versus our tillage sites, but they're actually quite comparable. But where we really see the difference now is that first graph, or the middle graph, is total phosphorus. The far right graph is dissolved phosphorus. And again, those no-till sites, we're seeing far more loss occurring in that dissolved form. We've had some cases where, you know, over 90% of the total loss in a given storm is in the dissolved fraction of phosphorus in these no-till systems. So going back to that balance again, you know, you've got your left-hand graph, which is soil loss, particulate phosphorus loss with soil loss, and tillage. Now you tilt way to the right-hand side, with the dissolved phosphorus loss, it's no-till systems predominantly in the wintertime period. Making sense? Okay. All right, so one of the optimal things to do, and this is the question for the industry, is how do we kind of get the best of both worlds with reducing soil disruption, yet getting those nutrients, specifically phosphorus, below that soil surface. And we're not stratifying it and really driving those wintertime losses. So we're really trying to find happy mediums, new technologies of ways of getting that phosphorus down below the soil surface so that it's not running off the surface, but yet not disrupting that soil and causing soil loss and particulate phosphorus loss. So one last example I've got for you that really kind of drives this point home is one of the watershed projects that we did in Jersey Valley, where we've got 3 different sites, edge of field sites that we're showcasing here. Site 2 is a pasture site. Site 4 is a no-till crop field, and site 5 is a tilled crop field. And one of the things, this first graph here is of dissolved phosphorus. And we can see there that, looking at just dissolved phosphorus, that when a lot of the wintertime runoff occurs, that the no-till systems are oftentimes higher or dissolved than our tilled site, where we have been able to incorporate that manure into the soil and it's not sitting on the soil surface. And in fact, that manure incorporation decreased the annual dissolved phosphorus loss by 50% or more, because that was incorporated into that versus the surface applied on the pasture and no-till fields. Yes. Correct. Corn silage, alfalfa, no cover crop. Two years corn, 3-4 years of alfalfa. So I'll tell you what, before we get into that I want questions. I'm just about done, and then I will follow back up with you. How about that? So then the final thing, again, now looking at total phosphorus, that picture changes. Again, from a total phosphorus perspective, we can still see in years where frozen soil runoff predominated, that we have that the tillage site was actually lower than the no-till and pasture site. But now we see those real dramatic changes when we're getting into that springtime runoff and we get some associated soil loss. The tillage systems definitely don't fare as well as the no-till systems when we get into that springtime phosphorus loss. So when manure was incorporated, it did increase the annual soil and total phosphorus loss by 50% or more, especially in those years where we had that late spring period where we were having most of our runoff occur. So again, it's really driving this point home of there are trade-offs both seasonally and with the different systems that we have out there. So kind of to wrap up the overall phosphorus trade-off ideas, just a couple other things I wanted to kind of throw out there as some major observations that we've seen is that in years where we've had a lot of ice crusting of the soil and some severe winter kill of alfalfa, we have seen phosphorus loss in that wintertime period that is very similar to a wintertime manure application, as those plant cells can lyse and release the phosphorus. There have been a number of other studies that, depending on the cocktail mix that's used in cover crops, some of these can winter kill again, based on the year, lyse those plant cells and release phosphorus. So consideration to take in, we're looking at all the different options that we have for management practices. Soil compaction can really significantly increase the runoff and resulting phosphorus loss. So especially as we get into no-till situations, compaction can become a very important factor on mitigating. And I know we've got a much better opportunity for not having compaction because of the increased carrying capacity of those soils typically. But when compaction occurs in no-till systems, it takes time and a lot of work to remediate some of the compaction that happens. And then finally, on the tillage side, some observations that we made early in some of our first Discovery Farms research is that when you do tillage on the contour, we were seeing some holding capacity in those furrows of that water. And this was actually just validated in a study by a PhD student, Melanie Stock, under Francisco Arriaga, who did some replicated plot trials, and they looked at that wintertime runoff and actually saw lower total runoff, lower total phosphorus, and lower total solids from manure that was applied in January and February to those plots in tillage as compared to no-tilled sites. So now we're going to really move on kind of the rest of this day into talking about some of the management options and tools that we have available to try to mitigate some of the nutrient loss that we have on our soils here in Wisconsin. One of the things that I have to do, because I sit on the advisory panel for this, is mention the runoff risk advisory tool. We continue to work on making this better, have less false positives, less false negatives. It's amazing what the designers have done with really enhancing the scale and capacity of this. If you haven't been on it in a while, please check it out. There are also other tabs that you can kind of see along the top that really can give you some great additional information as far as the different dynamics that are going on throughout the state and potential for runoff. And then finally, as you go through today, again, we're going to be talking about some of these tools that we have available. And we've got a bunch of different speakers lined up. They're going to talk about these. And I really want you to kind of think about three different things as you listen through the rest of today's talks, is to really try to understand some of the trade-offs and realistic expectations for a lot of the different practices and information that's going to be presented to you today. And then really take that information and recognize where some of the potentials that you have for loss on your farm could be. And then you can start to figure out ways to really kind of target those areas where you likely have the highest loss. And then once you get those addressed, really maybe start fine-tuning some of the slew of different practices that we have in combinations to really fine-tune that loss, to really try to create crops in the most productive yet efficient manner possible. So with that, I think we've got a few minutes for questions. So to get back, and I'll start off while we're getting the microphones ready, to get back to your question on, John, can you bring the microphone back to just clarify a little bit? So yes, the farming systems there, and I'm going to defer to Amber for some of the specifics of like the plots there, as that was in that area of the state. But what did you have any follow-up questions apart from just the? Okay. Other questions, concerns? Steve. So the question was, what are the dynamics and how does it change versus a winter cover crop that doesn't winter kill and grows back up like a winter wheat or a winter rye, as compared to some of the cocktail mixes that would typically winter kill? And I actually am going to defer that to Matt Ruark or others that have some more data on that. I do know that sometimes, at least in some of the literature that I've reviewed, there has been real diversity in whether we see any phosphorus loss, even in some of the ones that winter killed. And it's really based on severity and really the conditions of which they winter kill to cause that plant lysing and release. But again, unless Matt would have some more information that he could follow up with some of the work that he's doing, I don't think we have any data that would, not yet, but we're working on it. So, that answer your question? Best that I could. Oh, yes. Bill.
Here on your Twin Peaks of March and May, June being the big runoff events in aggregate. Does that hold consistently with each location, or could you, I guess what I'm getting at, are there site-specific exceptions or pathways that give some example as to solutions?
Yes, great question. And that really kind of encompasses everything. So I'm gonna just show quickly these two slides again, where again, Bill was referring to these two peaks, and to dive down into the detail of that, you know, again, that wintertime peak, or the wintertime peak is pretty much dissolved phosphorus. And again, that varies on the system. So a tillage system, for a number of different factors, has a little bit more benefit in that wintertime month with and incorporated manure and fertilizer has the benefit in those months for reduced loss in the dissolved form. But when we move into that springtime system, the no-till system, and you know, has the benefits as compared to the tillage system, but where in that time period we see much more particulate phosphorus loss associated with soil that's moving around. So again, it truly is this balance beam. And you know, when we look holistically, they're from a total loss perspective, they are pretty darn similar. Different pathways, different potential ways of addressing them based on the system. But you know, there is not one perfect farming system, and they all have these trade-offs. And I think that is really the focus today. We're gonna again focus this morning on phosphorus and the afternoon on nitrogen. But a lot of these practices are a win in one and can create some challenges in others. And you know, that's the real tough thing in the agriculture industry, is to really kind of take in all this information, because there are these trade-offs, and use that most effectively on their farm. And that's, you know, truly the toughest job that we are tasked as educators and researchers to do. So, yes.
I'm wondering if you can run the same numbers for that no-till loss if you remove farms that did not have any manure application at all. What would the dissolved impact be? I guess I'm kind of surprised that in aggregate, it sounds like the two farming systems are very similar. And I'm just wondering if the manure applied to the no-till systems is a key part of that dissolved fraction.
That is a great question, and I think I'm going to give a very brief answer, because I think you led so perfectly into our next speaker, who is going to talk exactly about a number of different farms there where commercial fertilizer is really, you know, the predominant way that they're applying nutrients. But I will say, in some of the studies that we've just finished up in Rock County, doesn't matter if it's manure, and it doesn't matter if it's commercial fertilizer for phosphorus. If it's fall applied, late fall, we see an increase in that wintertime runoff if it's surface applied. So doesn't matter if it's manure, doesn't matter if it's commercial fertilizer. If you still have that high concentration on the surface, we see it in wintertime runoff going into that wintertime period. So thank you for your time, and I'll be around all day if you have any additional questions.
Thank you, Eric. All right, Eric got us started on the right foot. I see Margaret's here. Awesome. So our next speaker, as Chelsea gets us set up here on the computer, this is my first time meeting Margaret in person, so this is a pretty exciting day. Margaret is coming to us. She's transitioning from a faculty position at the Ohio State University to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. All right, I love to steal somebody from Ohio and bring it to Wisconsin. Yes, we're glad you're here, and we're so glad you're here. So she's going to be in the Department of Biological Systems Engineering. Her research program provides science to support greater adoption of conservation measures to protect surface waters in agricultural regions. She seeks to quantify conservation effectiveness through monitoring farm fields and modeling fields and watersheds. In recent years, she supported the binational effort to reach water quality targets to address Lake Erie's harmful algal blooms. So we're so excited to have Margaret here in Wisconsin, probably your first Wisconsin speaking engagement, and really excited to learn more from you, Margaret. So take it away. All right. Is this thing on? Is it on now? How about now? Okay. Oh, there you go. Okay, sorry about that. How's this? Okay. Well, it's so good to be here. Coming from Ohio to Wisconsin and driving up here today with the beautiful mist rising up and like hiding the hills and the valleys. And I'm thinking, I want to get to know this place. But it also means that I'm speaking from a different geography and a different culture. And I might say some things today that are like, what's this about? Or this isn't the way we think about it. So apologize in advance if anything I say just doesn't quite jive with you. And I'd love to hear your feedback, get to know more about this place and the needs here and how my work can fit in the next phase of my career. So very excited to be here today. So conservation practice effectiveness quantified. It was the title that was suggested. I was like, sure. And then I thought about it some more and I thought like, that sounds like I've done something and it's all done and there's no more to work on here. And I thought that's like the opposite of what I'm going to say today. So this talk is going to be about sort of a case study in Ohio, how we are working on the problem of quantifying conservation practices that for phosphorus, as we've just heard a lot about those trade-offs, it has some difficult tensions and maybe some findings that don't really jive with what we historically have thought about these practices. And then moving on to like, and how do we use this understanding of conservation practices to make policy, to make change, to clean up Lake Erie. So that's where we're going today in this talk. I want to acknowledge that there are so many other people that have contributed to the work that I'm showing today. This is not just a one-woman show. Okay. So first, we're going to talk about quantification of conservation practice effectiveness, the research questions that we're asking right now in Ohio on both the monitoring and modeling side. The last talk, Eric really led in many ways to some of the findings we have right now and some of the treatments we have going on right now. But then I'm going to move more into modeling, which is a little different from what we just heard about, but some similar findings. Then we're going to talk more about Lake Erie as a case study, the algae bloom problems, how agriculture and phosphorus are related to that. And then zooming into one study that I've led about comparing multiple models, bringing multiple models to answer questions that are policy relevant about how to reach targets in Lake Erie. So the overarching research goal for the last several years of my career and what I see myself continuing for the next several years is focusing on both research and outreach for the purpose of increasing adoption of effective agricultural conservation to protect water quality and the environment. So what is effective agricultural conservation? We need to know that before we can encourage the adoption of these practices. On the phosphorus issue, that's really where I've spent a lot of my time, is looking at conservation practice effectiveness scientifically through both monitoring and modeling lenses. And then the adoption side is trying to fuel that adoption, is looking not only at this from a very hard science hydrological perspective, but also from the perspective of crossing disciplines and trying to understand barriers in adoption. So how do we know which conservation practices will work? The last talk really led this, perfectly, but there are some practices that might be better at looking at controlling dissolved versus particulate forms of nutrients. The Maumee River watershed drains to Western Lake Erie, and this is where my case study is today. And there is a lot in this watershed that makes it a good test bed for science.
it has a lot of data being taken. So all of these little marks are different data being taken in the watershed. And if you look, the little green diamond is edge of field sites from the USDA's Ag Research Service, which I think of as a little bit like the Discovery Farms. A lot of edge of field monitoring, river monitoring, USGS, and the Heidelberg University has an amazing river monitoring program where they have more than 40 years of daily nutrient data in tributaries in the state. And this is now focused more or less on like the research I touch, not necessarily everything going on in Ohio, but we have a lot of monitoring work going on at both the field and the edge of field to try to understand what is the effect of different conservation practices. So we're looking at water quality and quantity, soil health, and soil physical properties. So a lot of the same sorts of things I think that you are looking at here in the Discovery Farms. The research questions that we're asking in Ohio, I think there's some overlap with the questions that you all are asking in the Discovery Farms here, but we're looking at what is the nutrient loading effect of a soil health practices. The nitrogen side is somewhat established, but with phosphorus, that's a little bit confusing or uncertain at this point, depending on your soil and other management conditions. Also, how about when you have an elevated or high phosphorus soil? Some people call it legacy phosphorus. What is that going to do in a watershed or at a field scale in terms of your nutrient losses that you would expect? And then what are the water quality benefits of many practices that we call conservation practices? But we're not quite, sometimes we're not quite sure if they help in every way. I don't call them best management practices much because that sounds like they're best for everything, right? But maybe it's good for nitrogen, not phosphorus, or soil, but not dissolved phosphorus, So thinking about perennial crops, we have some treatments looking at that. Phosphorus filters, which are installed at edge of field and intercept tile drainage flows. Bioreactors, similarly for nitrogen. Surface field ditches, which are sort of like grass waterways, but really low topography landscape. Controlled drainage, cover crops, wetlands, and then also integrating different practices. So those are all treatments that we are gathering data on. I don't necessarily have the final story to tell you on those today, but I want you to know the sort of work that we have coming out of Ohio. I'm gonna move into modeling, and the rest of the talk is gonna be about modeling. So my work is even more than in the monitoring space, which is highly collaborative, and a lot of other people are in charge of those treatments rather than myself, is in the modeling sphere. So if we ideally, to establish conservation practice effectiveness, we should be doing that at edge of field and in field. If we don't have data at edge of field or in field, then we're kind of lost for knowing what to do at a larger scale. But it's, as you all know, cost prohibitive or labor prohibitive or difficult for other reasons to gather data at a lot of fields, and then to analyze that data and make sense of that data. So you all are doing a lot of that, but I'm sure you all feel like there's more that we could do. To look at questions at a watershed scale, especially the scale of, say, the Maumee River watershed or the Western Lake Erie Basin, it does require, or we are aided by, the use of models. The model that I'm going to be talking about today is a watershed scale model, but it can be, the smallest spatial unit can be a field scale. So the soil and water assessment tool, you all may know this model in and out or have heard of it, I don't know. I'll be calling it SWOT throughout the presentation. It captures these field scale drivers of nutrient loss and runoff, such as topography, soil type, land management, land use, then has inputs, daily inputs of weather data, and froze crops, simulates crop growth, etc., and then produces these flows of water and nutrients off fields into rivers and down to the outlet of a watershed. And it can be used to ask questions about conservation practices. For instance, cover crops could be installed in certain places, grass waterways, wetlands, etc. So this is a specific model setup that we have for the Maumee River watershed in my research group. So not every SWOT model looks like this, but what we did when we set up the most recent version of our model is we created the smallest spatial unit called the hydrologic response unit. Okay, so it just sounded different for a moment. You're still hearing me fine, right? At the field scale approximately. It's computationally difficult to get every single field into just a large model. And then, so that's like the bird's eye view of the model. But then if you look into the soil profile, the model simulates all the different soil layers from Surgo soil data. And these different horizons have movements, plants bringing up nutrients and water and infiltration, et cetera, all those processes included. And then in Western Lake Erie watersheds, one of the big drivers of water loss and nutrient loss with pathways, I guess, is through subsurface tile drains. And I know you have that, in parts of your state, those are common, and other parts not very common, but so this is a big deal in Western Lake Erie that used to be primarily the Great Black Swamp. So we drain through subsurface and surface channels. So the model can capture that. We can place those into the model, and we can route, water and nutrients through those. So this, I hope, gives you like a really basic idea, if you didn't know much about this model before, kind of what it looks like, how it breaks up a watershed, and then the simulation that would occur in a watershed. Now that same question about what research questions are we asking of the model, before I dive even a little deeper into a couple of these questions. So the ones highlighted in yellow are the ones that I'll take a deeper dive on in a moment. But how can we reach water quality targets at a watershed scale is a research question we can ask. Because in a model, we can say, what if we do this? And what if we do that? And let's try that. And let's see, what might the outcome be? Understanding the past, I will also tell you some about. There's some big questions about why has Lake Erie returned to these huge algae bloom problems. And so we, using the model, we're able to try to dig into the past and understand what the drivers were. Then comparing different nutrient sources, such as manure versus an organic fertilizer, different soils, our rivers are a significant source. And again, we need measured data in the watershed before we can answer these questions in the model too. It's not like we can only answer these by looking at a model, but a model can help. Capturing the effect of soil health on water quality by improving the model's representation of soil health is a question that we're asking. And then many questions about confidence in model outcomes. Some of you might feel like, I don't trust models, or I'm not sure about models. Like, I want that to be measured data at the field scale, and I want that too. But sometimes we need to use models. So how can we convey to the user of that model information, what is the associated uncertainty? How confident are we in these results? And so the other thing that I'm going to be talking about here in a little deeper way is using an ensemble of models to try to get at that question of confidence. And then sometimes we've looked at things like the critical source areas in a watershed, the accuracy of the models against edge of field data, such as Discovery Farms. It's hopefully in my future, using models in Wisconsin and looking some at the accuracy of the model against edge of field. And then questions like resilience to climate change, or thinking big picture into the future. So that's sort of paintbrush, what we're looking at in my research group, focused in Ohio at this point, bringing some of that here, hopefully. Now let's dig in a little more to Lake Erie. Lake Erie, you all probably know a fair amount or have heard a fair amount about the algae bloom problems in Lake Erie, and how historically we had a lot of difficult, eutrophication or nutrients drove algae blooms historically. And then for a while, it seemed like we didn't have that problem, and then it came back. So why is this happening? So back in 1978, we set the first water quality targets, and it was a whole lake target of 11,000 metric tons of total phosphorus. And after setting that, mainly point sources like sewage treatment plants and factories and the use of detergents, we were able to drop our phosphorus loads down to where they pretty much met that target every year. And I realize this only goes through like 2011, so we're missing some important recent data. But I like that this shows you over time that we've pretty much met that target. And yet in that latter time period, in the early to mid 2000s, we found that the algae blooms were returning even despite meeting these nutrient load targets. So why is that? And this brings us back to the Maumee River watershed. In 2014, around 2014, a lot of lake models were employed to try to understand the growth of algae and the drivers of that growth and what the new targets should be in order to limit our algae growth. And what we found is that the Maumee River watershed, which makes up most of Western Lake Erie Basin's watershed, so it's just a large watershed and heavily agricultural. The ones like right next to it still matter too, but we kind of focus on this one because we've got good monitoring data in the Maumee River. It's a large space, and we had also a lot of different models built for this watershed. So the lake models found we need to limit phosphorus loading also just from the Western Lake Erie Basin's watershed, which is made up primarily of the Maumee River watershed. So, and then also found that agriculture, being most of the land use, is a dominant source of nutrients. Why did the Maumee River watershed, like what changed? So when we look back at monitoring data for the last 40 plus years, daily data, that's great data that Heidelberg University has been collecting over the years, and we kind of smooth it out to look at trends, what we can see is that discharge or river flow didn't change that much from like the time the target was set in 1978 to 2000 or so, but then started really increasing more recently. But this, notice the 0 isn't shown on the y-axis, so these are all just kind of scaled to show you the shape. It's not a huge change. The total phosphorus load, the second figure, shows this like U-shaped pattern. So we had a decrease in total phosphorus, which is with us meeting that whole lake target. But then more recently has increased somewhat. Again, this change was fairly small compared to if we had 0 on this y-axis, but then the dissolved reactive phosphorus, again, more about dissolved phosphorus. The issue won't go away. So dissolved phosphorus, if you look at the scale, it goes from like 40 tons per minute, you can ignore the unit, but from 40 down to 20, up to 40 again. So it's like it went in half and then it doubled. So our loading and our concentration of dissolved phosphorus was super sensitive to something that happened in this time period. Was it driven by climate? Was it driven by management? These are the sorts of questions that scientists have been asking the last few years in Western Lake Erie. And one study that came before, but I'm going to show you that we did, looked a little bit more critically at the measured data and did some simple modeling to try to understand what the drivers were. And they did find that so the blue dots are for the early time period and the red are for the later time period. And they found that the concentrations were just higher for dissolved phosphorus in the later time period. And then they correlate that to tillage. And they said, well, we think that the culprit is reduced tillage. So that's kind of the story that you also were getting from the first talk. Dissolved phosphorus may be increased by stratification in a no-till system. Well, we went a step further because we felt there's more that changed in this watershed than just tillage over the years. Can we look at all of the management changes that we can quantify and we can put in a model and understand the effect of these management changes and the effect of climate at a daily time scale over this historical period. So what my graduate student, now postdoc Anna Apostel, did is she pulled together these different trends for different changes that occurred in the watershed. The crops grown changed. We have more soybean, less winter wheat. The fertilizers applied changed. So all of these bars are 5-year increments, data summarized or estimated, and it's 1980 to 2014. I know the x-axis isn't super clear, but these are just changes over time. In terms of fertilization, we had less phosphorus applied in general over the years, a little bit more nitrogen being applied over the years. Tillage, this is definitely where we get to a bigger shift. So we had a lot of continuous till early in the time period, and then a moving to rotational till, some years no till, some years till, and then definitely more actual continuous no till in the watershed, up to like 20% or so today. And then subsurface tile drainage. We don't really have a lot of data on exactly what happened here, but we know that more drains are put in every year at a tighter spacing to try to drain these fields faster. So in our model, we implemented a greater percentage of the watershed under intensive tile drainage over time. So we put all of these management actions and changes into the model, as well as climate change. And this is trying to show you that we took each 5-year increment of management and of climate and ran them together, even though they didn't all happen at the same time, to just see if history had been different and the management in 1980 happened in 2000 climate, how would that be? And then by looking at all the different permutations or combinations of climate and land management, we were then able to use analysis of variance to say, what are the main drivers of the response we're getting from this model? Is it management driven? Is it climate driven? That may or may not be clear to you exactly what we did there, but when we analyzed this data and we looked at what's driving these changes, what we found is that for discharge, we wrote Q here, but that's stream flow, discharge. Almost entirely discharge was driven in our model simulated to be driven by climate. So what the flow rate is in the Maumee River in a given 5-year period is pretty much just what's the rain that fell, what were the temperatures in the watershed, did it fall as rain or snow? Okay, but then when we drive into nutrients, which we think are driven by runoff, you know, these shouldn't discharge be the same, like shouldn't we see the same relationships between flow and nutrients? But what we really found is that for phosphorus and nitrogen, I know I'm not supposed to talk about that this morning, but we found that climate, the dark green, drove these somewhat, maybe 30 to 50 or 60% of the variation that we saw was due to climate inputs in the model. And yet management was also really important. Again, like 30 to 50 or 60% of that was management driven. And then I've written in here, even though that wasn't from the analysis of variance, that we further went into the model to try to understand. We ran these sensitivity analyses to find out which management actions are driving the management effect. And for phosphorus, reduced tillage was the primary driver of the changes, whereas for nitrogen, changing fertilizer rates was important. And I'm not saying that, so this is, again, remember, this is looking at historical data. So like if something didn't change much, then it wouldn't show up here, right? So these were historically the changes and that made the most difference. So reduced tillage for phosphorus, changing fertilizer rates for nitrogen. I will summarize in a moment after this third part, but what I see from all of that is that some similar lessons to what we just learned about the trade-offs with tillage, but I also see an optimistic message that the changes that occurred in the last 30, 40 years were not just from climate variations. If they were, what could we do about that? I mean, we would be kind of like, well, we'll have these maybe 30-year climate cycles and some will be good and some will be bad and we'll just accept what the lake does, right? The fact that we have such a management effect for phosphorus, especially because phosphorus is the main driver of the algae bloom size, means that there's something we can do. So that's, I think, an optimistic message that comes from that work. Third part here is what we're doing to help guide or come alongside those looking at policy in the region so that we can help to meet these targets. So let's go back in and talk maybe a little bit more about these targets. We had a whole lake target of 11,000 metric tons of phosphorus that seemed to work, and then it didn't work anymore. So, well, we dug in with these lake models to try to understand what the new targets should be. And where the old target was very simple, the new targets are much more nuanced and based on some stronger science. So the new targets, in summary, they're not only about total phosphorus, but also about dissolved reactive phosphorus. And there are loads and concentrations associated with those. It's a 40% reduction of 2008 values. That baseline of 2008, I think, was chosen because that was similar to your old target, but not everyone agrees, sort of arbitrary. But it's a significant reduction of both total and dissolved reactive phosphorus. Then there's this piece where we recognize that some years are just going to have impossible climate. So let's meet this target 9 years out of 10. Okay, so we're going to try to meet this target 9 years out of 10. And we should be meeting it somehow by 2025. This was established in 2016. Well, that's going to be interesting. So what we were tasked to do, all of these different models that were already, built for the Maumee River watershed, our colleagues, our partners in the States, in a couple different projects said, we want you to look together and try to get one message out of all of these models about what we need to do to reach these targets. So we came together to try to simulate possible paths to meeting the Lake Erie targets. I should also mention that those targets were all for the HABs, the harmful algal blooms, in Western Lake Erie's basin. There's also hypoxia in the central basin, cladophora problems in the eastern basin. So there's even more nuances, but we're just going to focus on the Western basin. And then I forgot to mention that not only are these targets so nuanced in terms of TP, DRP, and 9 years out of 10, but they're March through July targets. The lake models told us that the March through July inputs to the lake drive the summer harmful algal bloom, the summer algal bloom, which happens to also be harmful usually. So March through July in this topography and in this climate, which is probably a little different than yours, I was very interested to see the timing of your flow in your flow and nutrient discharge in Eric's presentation, that March was definitely a critical month, and then those June, et cetera. It's like maybe there's some similarities here, but anyway, March through July, important time period. So using 5 different versions of the soil and water assessment tool, SWAT model, set up by different modeling groups across a couple different states and different institutions, we came together to try to come up with what these models say about how we can meet these targets. We built these scenarios of possible paths, because paths mean like changing things in the watershed, in conversation with partners in the state that really, in the tri-state area, that really spanned environmental, governmental, and farming advocates. So that it was diverse in its interests. And this partner advisory group has been one of the most beneficial things like that I've been a part of in the last 5 or so years. Like, this has been just wonderful. They've really helped us in our research, and I think we've helped them some, but like even by having stakeholder meetings, they have gotten to know each other, and some really good things have happened for a lot of people out of these meetings. So that's an aside, but I believe in these. These are good. Then we ran scenarios with these 5 different SWOT models to say, like, what is the effectiveness of individual practices? Knowing that we need to do more than one practice, and one practice may not work everywhere. And like, okay, set that aside, and let's just like run each practice through our model across the watershed to understand what is the potential effect of this practice in our watershed. And I know you can't really read these axes, but I'm going to lead you through a few of our findings. To orient you to the figure, so which is a little bit complex, up is green, which is decreased concentration. The stakeholders or partners wanted us to have up be good. So up is decreasing our concentration of phosphorus coming out of the Maumee River watershed. And total phosphorus is the light blue, dissolved reactive phosphorus. Concentrations are the orange. These are box plots like you saw in the last presentation. And the box, that variation is from the 5 SWOT models. Like, that's why there is a variation there. This is looking over 10 years. Yeah, 10 years of data summarized coming out of a model. And then those 5 different results are plotted here in a box plot. So that like whisker shows you how variable the model set of practice might be. And this is getting back to that confidence piece. You know, if all the models say the same thing, we might have higher confidence. If they say different things from one another, we might have lower confidence. But at least we know something about what range of expectation we might have in this watershed. All right, so the practices that decreased concentration, the one that really decreased both total phosphorus and dissolved reactive phosphorus, was subsurface application of phosphorus. Again, back to Eric's presentation. Get that phosphorus into the soil. And then we had scenario 10 was like a 4 R's of nutrient management that included subsurface application. And so it also was really, really positive. You know, those bars are well above our 0 line there. Cereal rye, can you see if I put my, oh yeah, I can do this. Oops. Cereal rye cover crop was interesting in that for total phosphorus, it was very beneficial in the models, and they all okay, maybe that's not a good idea. They all pretty much agreed about that. But for dissolved reactive phosphorus, that change was very small, still positive, but small. And so that comes back to a question about maybe like, I don't know, but like the effect of cover crops, there is some literature to suggest that for phosphorus, it's not a clear picture, especially dissolved, what the effect of that cover crop would be. When we broadcast phosphorus, try this, all the way over here, that's a negative. And then headwater wetlands, okay, I'll stop. Headwater wetlands were a little bit like the models had not that much agreement about the direction of change of those. So anyway, those are a few of the results that that you can see coming out of our single practice scenarios. But that's not where we wanted to end. what we wanted to do is we wanted to pull multiple practices together that we thought would be the most effective for phosphorus and see what rates of implementation you might need to reach the target loads. So these are the effectiveness of bundled or combined practice scenarios. Again, the x-axis is too small for you to read, but I'll lead you through what I think is the important finding. The baseline, I really wish I could use this thing. Wonder. No. Yeah, we're good. I'll just work from left to right here. The baseline means the model run with what our best understanding of practices that occurred between 2005 and 2015 or 2014. And what we can see there, that the y-axis is years the target is met. And again, we have total phosphorus in blue, dissolved phosphorus in orange. We need to meet this 9 years out of 10. That's why we've got green on the top. So if we get up to that green, then we're meeting the target, or we would have met the target with those practices in those years. Okay, the baseline showed that 3 out of 10 years, we were already meeting that target. Well, that's good. So 3 years out of 10, we're meeting the targets that have been established. And then if we start with total phosphorus, the blue, if we implement, I'll just summarize that all of these scenarios were something like 50 or more % of cropland receiving 1 to 3 new conservation practices. So at least half of cropland receiving 1 to 3 new practices. That's a lot. Our partners said that we could go up to those rates perhaps in our simulations. There's some survey data to suggest that farmers are already starting to adopt some of these practices. The practices that are bundled we have cover crops, subsurface placement of phosphorus fertilizer, buffer strips. Those are in the first 2, and then we have the first 3 there, and then we have wetlands in the 4th as an addition there. We have no-till brought in the 5th, as well as the 6th has some drain water management. Anyway, we've got a number of different practices bundled together, but at least half of cropland receiving 1 to 3 new practices. That's I think important information here. All right, for total phosphorus, the models suggest that maybe we can reach that target under certain applications of certain practices at these rates, like that one that just barely, that median, that average is reaching that target in the model. Or at least we'll get maybe 8 years out of 10. So this is, I think, a promising message for total phosphorus, even though I acknowledge, and everyone acknowledges, it's a heavy lift to expect this much conservation to be added to the watershed. Dissolved phosphorus is not as optimistic a story. So when we look at the orange bars, the median line, that horizontal dark line there in the middle, shows that all of these scenarios only bump us to 4 years out of 10 meeting the target. 4 years out of 10, and we already were meeting 3. So that's 1 extra year meeting the target. Now, there are people that think dissolved phosphorus is driving the algae blooms even more than particulate phosphorus because it's more bioavailable or readily taken up by algae in the water. I mean, that's not necessarily fully established, but there are different views on that matter. I think both forms of phosphorus matter here. But this is a difficult message to swallow. With this much conservation, we can't make it further, you know? Anyway, so I didn't try to come here to depress you today, but I thought it would be interesting to you to see that in Ohio, we're making some progress and we're trying to figure out what we can do, and we're trying to reach these targets that are science-based, and we have some hurdles to overcome, definite hurdles. Coming from that work that was completed a couple of years ago, our models are continuing, and the model that I talked about in the first part of the presentation is continuing to provide support for an adaptive management process with the state. The state recognizes it is a long ways to go, and they're starting to fund conservation at a higher rate through this H2 Ohio program. But they've selected their initial list of practices to incentivize based only on total phosphorus expectations. They haven't even estimated what dissolved phosphorus improvements would come from these practices. Well, those practices have dissolved phosphorus in mind. That's like they focus on total phosphorus. So again, that dissolved phosphorus target might be even harder to reach if we're not really focused on it. We're continuing to monitor the needs are to continue to monitor practices for DRP reduction, because if we, these results are model results. There might be wrong. I mean, they're not perfect. And maybe our models don't know the full benefit of certain practices for dissolved reactive phosphorus. Maybe we don't even have that established in the measured data so that we could improve our models. So I think there's still space for us to hone this work to better understand dissolved phosphorus transport. So more monitoring of DRP reduction from practices is needed, and the monitoring you're doing here is helpful too. It's not like it has to be necessarily in a certain state, but in a similar environment. And then more modeling to help guide progress towards goals, because over time we need to shift our priorities based on what our targets are, et cetera. So I think I'm coming up close on time, and I just want to close saying that I think there are reasons for optimism for Lake Erie. I see that there's understanding of the past can help us, know that yes, changing management